All right, it is late August, and it is a beautiful, sort of rainy, misty day right now. It's been a really dry summer. It's been a great summer, but you can tell everything is just a little bit drier. The grass has a bit of sort of crunch to it, and the duck pond is more just like a donut of mud with a little bit of water in the middle. I'm not sure if the ducks mind or not, but hopefully this rain over the last few days will make everything look a little bit greener as we go into autumn. Hopefully we'll see a little bit more water in the streams and everything. So my guest today is Matthew Remski, and Mathew is a yoga teacher, yoga practitioner. He's also an author of several books, articles, some poetry. He's also a podcaster. So he's one of the hosts of Conspirituality, which is an interesting podcast that sort of looks at this confluence of wellness culture and internet culture and the sort of strange dynamics that come out of that sometimes. I wanted to get Mathew on today, specifically because of some of the books he's written. So he's written a few books. Surviving Modern Yoga is one of them, and another one called Practice and All Is Coming, which is about abuse and cult dynamics in yoga. And this conversation today isn't specifically about yoga, but it is sort of about how there seems to be something in the fitness space that allows weird social dynamics to emerge. Sometimes that could look sort of like cult-like activity. Sometimes it could look like charismatic leaders or charismatic figures, influencers, Fitspo, sort of fitness Instagram. And, this just general sense that I think a lot of people have that things are getting weirder out there. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot recently, the effects of the algorithm. I'm not the first person to talk about how there seems to be some sort of incentive in social media that sort of rewards people for showing the most extreme version of whatever it is that they're talking about. And working with an organization that does have a social media presence, it's interesting because you do see that sort of temptation, that sort of force to try to make things a little bit more extreme, try to make things a little bit weirder, try to do whatever you can to get higher on the various social media feeds. And I think Jill does a really good job of resisting that. But it's something I've been thinking about a lot as I also just think about the weird incentives of fitness culture in general. So I wanted to get Mathew on to talk about that. And this is a really good conversation, I think. Mathew is really passionate as he's talking. He's a really thoughtful speaker. He does drop a few F-bombs. So if you are listening with kids or you're sensitive to swearing, just be mindful of that. He doesn't do it too much, but just letting you know ahead of time. And the conversation does get into some political topics, which I really enjoyed. But most of it will be talking about abusive dynamics in fitness and wellness circles, and then also talking about how we can learn from Matthew's experiences and try to apply them to a more social and community-minded set of goals. Anyway, I really enjoy this one. I hope you do as well. Talk to you after the episode.
How to stand on shifting sand. How to bend but stay intact.
Okay, today I'm here with Matthew Remski. Mathew is someone I've wanted to have on for a while. I'm a big fan of the podcast that he helps with, which is called Conspirituality, which I think is really interesting. And I've been following his work for a while. I first found him through an interesting YouTube video when I was doing some research on the history of yoga. And I've also read a few of his books, which I have found really fascinating, really even-handed, and really thoughtful. But I want to let Mathew introduce himself in his own words. So, hi, Mathew. Who are you, and how did you get here?
Well, thanks, Andrew. That's my name. I'm 53. I'm speaking to you from Toronto. It's been a long and twisted journey. I was born Catholic into a union family. My, politics and worldview have been pretty leftist from early on. My first real sort of passion having to do with probably some, neurodiverse stuff that has never really been assessed, but I think is pretty much there is a totalizing obsession with writing. which turned into, you know, having a run at being a novelist in my 20s, writing a bunch of books of poetry, but also that happening during a time in which, you know, the labor market that I was expecting to sort of move into, perhaps as an intellectual laborer, that I was sort of forecast towards in the 1980s, was starting to fall apart in the 1990s. Um, and I did a lot of wandering from, service job to service job, trying to, publish little books and larger books and with varying degrees of ambition and success. But the sort of wandering, deracinated life really drew me into, a kind of social need, which was the precursor for being involved in two cults over about 6 years, and that was really sort of a foundational, moment or period for me, because from that point, I had to, figure out what had happened, what high demand groups were, why I had been sort of drawn in so easily, what kinds of needs they served. And I started on, well, first of all, before I got into journalism on cults, I kind of eased my way out of the less rational spiritual world by becoming a yoga teacher for about 10 years. Um, and, that's a world that has its own problems, but there was something relatively secular about it. And it was adjacent enough to, fitness and wellness ideologies that were less, sort of highly charged, but again, with their own problems, that I was able to find a certain amount of recovery in the yoga world. But then I also started doing cult journalism on the yoga world itself, and I started, researching its deeper modern history. So that's been, another sort of 10 years at this point, and now I'm a parent of two. Um, One kid is 12, the other kid is 9, and the 9-year-old is autistic, which has been the most sort of radicalizing experience of my life so far. And now I'm writing and researching about anti-fascism. So here I am.
Well, it sounds like you'll have good job security in that. Well,
Yeah, unfortunately, we'll see.
yeah, I guess maybe you're on the slightly safer side of the border there. You can tell from my accent, I'm not from the UK originally. I'm from the States, and
Well, I was born in Michigan, so I'm a dual
okay,
citizen.
okay.
But my passport is now expired, and I've been debating back and forth whether or not to renew it. I'm still filing taxes with the IRS every year. Um, I don't know that I'll be traveling across the border, given my, sort of current political profile.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm going back to the States actually in a few weeks with my family, none of whom are American citizens.
Right.
Uh, and it's the sort of thing where, the rest of my family is British, so I think there's a certain amount of safety of privilege sort of embedded in that. But at the same time, it's interesting to have that sense of not even just hesitation, but almost like a dread
Yeah.
of going back. But anyway, I guess I'll save that for another for another podcast. Um, so the listeners, based on your introduction, will have ascertained that we're probably going to talk about cults or cult dynamics or social dynamics, and it's because it's something I don't have much of a background in. I really want to get the language correct on this, or at least sensitive. So I know you use the language high demand group. I've also heard high coercion groups. I've also, I think, perhaps new religious movement is something, or variations of that. I was wondering if you could kind of let's just set the language, because if we're going to talk about cult dynamics, I want to make sure that I kind of get my language right and don't paint with too broad a brush.
It's a great place to start because the language of cult discourse has been contested for decades. And it's something that, as somebody who has survived a couple of groups, you don't really realize until you grasp a kind of larger view. As a person coming out of cultic environments, there's a very sort of robust, um, I would say, like explanatory framework for how bad these organizations are, and um, how skillfully they sort of weaponize your own vulnerabilities against you, and so on. And so, there are a number of checklist definitions that are really compelling coming out of that environment. One of them comes from Michael Langoni, where he defines the cult as being governed by deception, dependence, and dread of leaving, which I think, is a good summary. There are other checklists that come to us from people like Steve Hassan, who, had a 2-year stint in the Moonies or the Unification Church in the 1970s. And he has a whole sort of, series of checklists around coercive control, or, charismatic control. And those are all very useful. And they almost have like a mathematical, I don't know, sense about them. It's like, if these elements are all in place, then you're going to be in a really tough spot.
Yeah,
And I
almost like
think
a DSM diagnosis in a way.
yes, yeah, it does function that way. Um, but when you dig a little bit deeper, the definitions are actually a little bit watery, right? Because they hinge on things like, a phrase like charismatic control. And, charisma itself, going all the way back to Max Weber, is actually pretty hard to define. And it's why some people feel like, gnawing their arm off as soon as they hear Tony Robbins open his mouth, and why some people think, oh, I am going to invest $10,000 in 4 years of my life in his programs. Like, there's no real, like, charisma is actually an intersubjective experience. And, some people find, Zoran Mamdani to be, terrifying, and other people find him to be like incredibly warm and gracious. So if you have like really very subjective terms at the heart of all of these, these checklists, what happens is that you can really begin to sort of form a kind of exclusionary, or I would say a view of the cultic milieu as though it's kind of some sort of aberration, where everybody has lost their minds or something like that. But I have come to believe more in the notion that cultic organizations are actually pretty standard in human sociology. They're not really surprising. Um, and that maybe the most helpful definition along a sort of spectrum of endangerment comes to us through the psychological work on disorganized attachment. So we have these checklist models that I think create very sort of hard categories, where people are often asking, like, oh, was I in a cult? Is it a cult? How did I get out? When did I cross the threshold into? When did I cross the threshold out of? It doesn't really feel like that. And that's why I think that the work of Alexandra Stein is so important to me. She's a social psychologist who really defines cultic engagement in this interpersonal and social way through the lens of disorganized attachment. She says that if you get into a situation in which you are compelled to stay around a particular figure or within a group because you are confused about whether or not they love you or they are going to kill you, then you're probably in a bad social situation. And what's wonderful about that, and really just chilling too, is that it it uh, it kind of creates a continuity between, a domestic abuse relationship in which, the person is loving in on one day, but then they're terrifying the next, and you don't know really what you're going to get. And as the sort of submissive, or the dominated person in that role, you generally opt to stay within the relationship for the promised safety. But you're not quite sure that that's what's going to be on offer. This happens, with, the children of alcoholic parents, you know. And so I think really this model of disorganized attachment, in which you are running towards something that is actually terrifying, but you confuse that terror for a kind of ecstasy, is, I think that's a very, very powerful and very generalized way of looking at bad social situations. You brought up also the the notion of the new religious movement, and I think that is something that, as a recent survivor, I did not take seriously as a concept, in the same way that it would have taken me a long time to really get Alexandra Stein's work. And I think one thing that I want to say is that for anybody who is coming out of an environment like that and they pick up Steve Hassan's book, they will find it very, very helpful, right? Combating mind control. And it's like, the checklist makes it very clear that you were probably subject to some things that were definitely not in your interest, and they're predictable, and other people have been through them, and there's names for them and stuff like that. All of that is really helpful. But as that discourse matures, and because so many of these groups are actually religious or spiritual in nature, or have that as their content, in religious studies, there is this sort of category of organization called the New Religious Movement, which is developed to counter the stigmatizing language of the cult by saying, basically, it's not really fair to assume that people are practicing this religion in a unique, eccentric, and perhaps intense way, but that means that it's not actually an authentic religious organization or experience. We can call it a new religious movement, and that is a little bit more neutral. And I can say that when I first came across this argument, I'm like, you know, you guys are fucking academics who have not been through this, and you're actually becoming apologists for really toxic organizations, and you're doing that probably to gain ethnographic access to those people so that you don't insult them by calling them cult members. And that's working out for you, but how about for the rest of us? And I think that's a valid response. But at the same time, the good point that the religious studies scholars make, who promote this idea, is that not everybody's experience of a high demand group within a religious context is negative, right?
Mm.
And not every experience is uh, necessarily worse than where they came from, right? Like,
Yeah.
it's like you can very much get involved with Shambhala Buddhism and your life improves because it was really shit before. That doesn't mean it was a healthy organization at the top, but at the same time, it might be big enough that you might not come into contact with the more toxic social elements of it, and you're really actually just practicing it as a religion. And so I think that uh, what I want people to be aware of is that when they engage with cult literature or descriptive literature, it's good to be aware when you are hearing language that is like really, really sort of rigid, or condemnatory, or black and white. And unfortunately, I think all of that has ramped up over the last couple of years, maybe 5 years or so, because cults are now a kind of central content mill for,
Yes.
streaming Netflix
Almost
series.
a variation of true crime or something. There's kind of
It
salacious element
that's
in.
that's exactly it, and I'm glad that you brought that up, because I think that the role that stuff plays is similar to the role of propaganda, in the sense that, if you can show that these groups are just so weird and they have to be shut down, and we have to like get the leaders, and we have to like, and this is not to say that Keith Raniere shouldn't be in jail for the rest of his life, but what it does do is it makes an organization like Nexium seem like it's really, really unique, right? And I don't think it is. I think it is a over the top version of what's happening, in various subsections of Amazon, or of Meta, or something like that,
Yeah.
right? Like, and the thing
Or
that I want
Silicon
to
Valley in general.
yeah, and the thing that so I've come to also realize that a lot of cult literature and criticism and discourse is kind of depoliticized, because what it tries to do is it tries to say these groups, or this way of being in the world, is just so sort of out in left field. It's so bad. It's so different from the norm. And I'm like, actually, the cult is a really sort of logical outcome of concentrated capitalism, right? Like it's not really that, all of the power is flowing to the top, all of the exploitation flows down, people get, immiserated, and and you call it a day. It's like it's not really that mysterious. And so yeah, I try to demystify whenever I can.
Yeah, I really like the frame that you provide, and I took a few notes as you were talking, and I think one of the initial points that you came back to as well, which is that yeah, we try to cult dynamics, whatever we want to call them, are probably much more common to various degrees in all sorts of organizations. In a way that having various cult dynamics probably makes organizations more sticky and more maybe not sustainable, but more likely to survive over time.
And to recruit and to build branding. Yeah.
All these things, and like ultimately, I would like I'd like the second half of this conversation to move towards various fitness organizations. I'll use CrossFit as an example because it's a household name. I don't know if it's necessarily the best example or not, but I know there's been discussion on that in the past, and I really like how you situate this in the context of capitalism as well, which is something that I'd like to talk about. And I think you make that point very clearly in your books as well. So, eventually I would like to talk about social media and influencers and how much of, these cult dynamics models map over that. I guess what I would like to do, I guess I've got one more question here, and then I'd like to ask you about your work in yoga specifically. And I think Keith Raniere and Nexium is a good example of this, where you said that these are exaggerated versions of dynamics that we might see in other organizations. And this is the next thing I want to be careful about as I talk about this, because I think that we will see certain patterns um, sometimes in people who end up in these situations. But I want to be very careful not to make it seem like it's victim blaming or there's anything wrong with the individuals, while at the same time recognizing that there are probably systemic forces um, that sort of draw people in to these relationships, whether it's because of the breakdown of pre-existing social organizations, whatever it is, the lack of a third place, the lack of these moderating institutions that people might have had in the past. So um, it's one of the things that I'm mindful of, because I'm probably going to ask you some questions over this conversation in terms of maybe commonalities or patterns or things like that. But I also don't want to fall into this pattern of victim blaming. So how do you hold that tension when you think about this?
Well, I think one of the most um, useful ideas that comes out of the cult literature most broadly is that um, your recruitment into a group that's going to exploit you really doesn't come out of the blue. The demographics are broad. In the groups that I was in, people came from all walks of life, but everybody shared some kind of what's called situational vulnerability. Right?
Okay.
They
So,
had been through a divorce, they had been sick, they had lost a job, they had become disillusioned politically, they checked out of one thing or another, and this left them sort of vulnerable and exhausted to the task of trying to figure out what to do in an alienating world. And I think that um, there can be particular sort of psychological buttons that are pressed within people that will accelerate or lock in their recruitment or get them over the threshold at a particular time. But there's such a confluence of um social, political, and economic factors in everybody's circumstance that you know I'm just it's really hard to uh it's really hard to ever justify the notion that somebody somehow got involved in Nexium because they were gullible, right? I just don't think that that's ever really the case. They were effectively sold something, and there was a certain amount of deception involved in that sales job. And the fact about deception is that you don't know that it's happening. That's what makes it deception, right? Like there's so You know, having said that, I would also say that one of the hardening or rigidifying aspects of cult discourse is that it does divide um, people up into, especially those whose stories are being told, up into perpetrators and victims in a very kind of, I would say, sometimes simplistic way. And what happens in that circumstance is that people can have like very longer journeys in figuring out what exactly they did once they were in a group to sort of perpetuate not only their own membership but to recruit others. um, when you wind up having your sort of agency stripped away from you, it's very easy to pass that wound down the line. And it's very easy to sort of lose your sense of, your own responsibility within that sort of, uh, you know, downstream effect. So that's one thing that I can say is that a disadvantage of the black and white narratives that come out of streaming cult documentaries is that you know there are victims and perpetrators everywhere. And yes, people at the top are generally incredibly exploitative and monstrous in their ways, and sometimes they themselves are the sort of creations of their own followers. There are never really clean and clear stories, but there are sort of general parameters of, oh, these relationships are about exploitation and the dedication to some sort of invisible ideal that isn't really going to help me. So there are definite red flags that can still be sort of seen to wave around.
I I guess I'd like to talk about yoga specifically, but briefly with the caveat though, even if we're talking about some cases and organizations within yoga, I don't think that as a whole what we're talking about is unique to yoga for the reasons that you pointed out ahead of time. So I'd like to talk about yoga, and really in three parts, I suppose. Which is I found actually I didn't realize when I was listening to you on Conspirituality that you're the same Matthew that had also written some of these books. But I found you, um, through thinking about yoga, which I'm not a practitioner, but as an organization, I think it's as a movement, I think it's interesting because I've had my foot in the fitness industry in various ways as a personal trainer, as a CrossFit coach in the past, and it's always been interesting just to interact with yoga, the perception of yoga. So I'd like to talk to you about your work on some of the systemic abuse within yoga, and then I would also like after we're done with that conversation, I'd like to talk about the history of yoga, perhaps maybe the folk history of yoga, and maybe how that might be at odds with some of the specific, I don't know, I'm going to say maybe historical facts of it. That's a bit complicated, but we can unpack that later. But first, I was wondering if you could talk about some of your work in your books about this. There's this period, well, I guess probably about maybe 10 years ago, not quite 10 years ago, where it seemed like there was a series of articles in the news where various leaders, gurus in yoga were suddenly getting in trouble for all kinds of sexual abuse. And I think it almost happened so suddenly that a lot of people, if they weren't in that world, it sort of passed them by. I was wondering if you could just provide a little bit of context for that, please.
Yeah, so it's a little bit odd to sort of be so invested in a subculture and to know that what we had peaking in sort of 2018, 2019, along with the Me Too movement, was, as you say, for a lot of people kind of a flash in the pan, while also knowing that what was actually being disclosed at that point was sort of at the end run of about 30 years of whisper networks and also previous articles. So like one very odd thing that I can describe is that a very famous Iyengar yoga teacher in San Francisco, Manuso Manos, was outed as a um, as an alleged repeated sexual predator on his students in an article in the San Jose Mercury News in 1991. And, um, the San Jose Mercury News is not digitized. So I spent maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years just sort of hearing peripherally about how Manos is somebody who might not treat people very well, or he has complicated relationships with so and so, like whatever. Like there was this buzz around this cultural figure, and I didn't know what the details were. And it was only by chance running into somebody, one of the women who had been quoted in that paper in 1991, that I got a photocopy, like a photocopy of the newsprint from 1991 that laid out this entire incredible investigative story that was never denied by him. And then I was able to go back and dig deeper and figure out that, oh, well, he'd actually been somewhat castigated by his superiors or by his colleagues in the California or the American Iyengar Yoga Association, and then he had been, dressed down by, Iyengar himself, and but then he had been restored after about a year or something like that, and he had gone on as regular, and then of course, behaviors like that don't generally stop. So by the time we get to 2017, 2018, there's a new round of accusations, and then this whole backstory that had kind of been forgotten uh, comes to the fore again. So it was, I mean, it's a problem that has been known about, especially by women in the yoga world, for, I would say, 40 years. And these are people who have been chronically disbelieved or minimized or told that they were perverts, actually, because they thought that their teachers sexually assaulting them was actually a bad thing instead of some sort of healing practice. So that was actually a focal point of my research into Patabi Joyce, who became a case study for this book that I wrote called Surviving Modern Yoga. And it detailed testimonies from 19 women who described being sexually assaulted by Patabi Joyce under the guise of being physically adjusted or assisted. And, most of these people had told their friends or their colleagues, or they had gone to the intermediary teachers and had said, what is going on here? And they had been shut down, or they'd been denied, or they'd been blacklisted, or they'd been, thrown out of the society in some way. And then it took a woman named Karen Rain to come forward on Facebook at a particular moment and say, hey, me too. I spent X number of years every day being assaulted by Patabi Joyce. This is who he was. And that unleashed a floodgate of networked, whisper relations previously that then became public. And, I was kind of like on the reporting ground floor of that. And that's how I sort of compiled the information and was able to corroborate it. But it was not a unique story. It was actually a pretty standard story. And that most of the entrepreneurial international yoga gurus that attained fame in the 70s and 80s, a lot of them had the same sort of history of allegations against them, from Yogi Bhajan to Bikram Choudhury to, I did a big piece on Swami Vishnudevananda as well, of the Shivananda Yoga organization. So the characteristics there were all sort of, charismatic leader who was imbued with a kind of sort of spiritual authority and specialness, who could do no wrong, and who was either celibate or pretending to be celibate, or never had a sexual thought in their lives, and was, dealing with the bodies of female students in ways that were rationalized as being healing, but were actually, obviously predatory and invasive. And yeah, that was just sort of a standard practice, probably within the larger organizations, more common than not common, unfortunately. And Yeah, so that was really that took up about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years of my reporting life.
Yeah, I mean, just in scale, I think in Surviving Modern Yoga, at one point, there's some, sort of loose calculations about the length of Patabi Joyce's career,
Yes,
how many
right.
people he met, and, obviously not being official, but I mean, we're talking about, in this case, one individual who probably abused literally thousands.
Yeah, tens of thousands of individual assaults, right? If you took his teaching days, multiplied by years, multiplied by how many classes per day, and how often he would actually, grope or hump or trigger warning, digitally rape women in his room, then yeah, tens of thousands of individual assaults, you know, and probably one, I think, maybe two instances in which he was doing exactly that, not in India, where it was a lot easier for him to sort of wield his social power, but a couple of instances on tour in various places in which he came very close to being arrested. And then whoever had been assaulted was able to be sort of like talked down by Joyce's handlers, right? Um, and so I think one of the things that was most important to me about the reporting was to, and this is why I used the language of cult dynamics, was to show how the senior leadership of that organization, so his senior students, were all aware, for the most part, maybe not of the extent to which he was abusing his students, but they were aware that he had this issue that they did not understand, they were too ashamed to deal with, but they went farther with that often to tell, his accusers that they were wrong or mistaken or, insane, or that they should seek therapy. And the thing that is so outrageous about that is that that's why they have careers now. Uh, if any of them, because it's not just that they covered up their guru, they also covered up their meal ticket, because the only authority that some of these people had came through this guy. And if they had blown the whistle on what he was actually up to, what he was actually doing, their sort of status in the world, the credibility of their own learning would be trash, because there is nothing really there in terms of expertise. There's a lot of hype, and this is the other sort of pillar of this, and maybe this gets into the history of modern yoga a little bit, which is that Patabi Joyce basically invented his
Yeah,
technique and called it ancient and
yeah.
sacred, and
So I think,
yeah, he made it into this sort of spiritual thing that gave him a kind of like hall pass to do whatever he wanted with his students, and because the sort of the hype or the specialness of the practice was all about this spiritualization, which is really built on sand. If you actually criticized who this guy was just as a person, there's nothing left, right? And so it's the whole thing is very, very precarious. And I understand why people sort of tried to maintain this halo around this guy, but it also led to some really, really sort of painful, paradoxical, terrible outcomes.
yeah, and these are patterns that we see over and over and over again in organizations where people have kind of hitched their wagon to the star of a certain charismatic leader. I think we should go ahead and talk about the origins of modern yoga, but also I think talk about, I mean, as much as you feel comfortable talking about it, sort of talking about also Western ideas of physical culture, physical hygiene, and maybe perhaps how there's that sort of dialogic relationship between the two, and maybe the context in which yoga came out, perhaps relative to other physical cultures in Western Europe, because I think it's quite complicated, and I would just like to hear your take on it.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I think that there's two stories that I love to tell about
Hmm.
the distance between how, yoga in the global north is basically understood historically, or it has been, and what the reality was. And the first one is that 1969, Woodstock opens with Swami Satchidananda on the hill, and he's going to chant Om, and he's also going to chant Jai Ram or something to Lord Ram. And he invokes peace and equanimity and healing. And this is to a generation that is exhausted by protest, that has not been able to bring the Vietnam War to an end. It's going to go on for another 3 years or 4 years or whatever. And um, there's this sense in which he has some kind of elevated knowledge that he can offer everybody that will magically transform the world. And it's really sort of at this point that we get this be the change that you want to see kind of philosophy entering into new spirituality, but also wellness culture. And you can see Satchidananda's disciples like fanning out on the stage, and they're all sitting upright, and they're all very sort of, well dressed in very clean robes and stuff like that. And the hippies are all, the opposite. They're slouched over and smoking dope, and they're dirty and muddy and stuff like that. And what the people on that hill have no idea about is that Swami Satchidananda comes out of a Hindu nationalist influenced reconstruction of yoga as a kind of soft power that is meant to unify uh, Indian identity after colonialism. It is a understandable physical culture response to British imperial rule, but in very strange ways, it also mimics some of the somatic dominance of that very rule. So, if you think about the sort of the emphasis on straightness or uprightness of posture, or of a kind of pride in self-presentation that we see in the photographs of Mr. Iyengar, that stuff has very little to do with the transgressive and often antinomial yoga traditions of India from the Middle Ages. What it has to do with is, uh, you know, proto-Indian nationalists in the 1920s and 1930s saying, how can we throw off the bodily humiliation of colonial oppression and reconstitute our nation as something, as a people worthy of respect? And so we get these very straight, proud, upright postures, right, that are quite stiff, actually. The Tadasana of BKS Iyengar pretty much looks like military posture, right? And um, the there's this missing of this kind of reaction formation in physical culture coming out of India. It is believed that this is meant to indicate peacefulness, but it's not really about peace so much as it is about self-control and self-discipline. And but nonetheless, through the postures of Iyengar and a bunch of others, and Bikram Chowdhury is like this as well, um, the whole feeling that people want to have of relief, of spiritual relief that people want to have from yoga, is sort of elided slowly into the 70s and 80s into a project of trying to become self-disciplined, trying to build yourself up, trying to become a wholesome and noble individual. And that melds very well with the kind of neoliberal abandonment of social ideals, right? It's like we couldn't end the war in Vietnam, so we're going to work on our own bodies, kind of thing. And then a similar story is one of Iyengar's most sort of prominent, devoted American students, a woman named Patricia Walden. She talks about, after BKS died, I think, she's on stage with Manuso Manos, and she's talking about how Iyengar really sort of changed her yoga practice, because in the 60s, she said we loved yoga as kind of like flow and glow. We would gather in a church basement, and we would just move, and we would breathe, and we would feel our bodies, and then Mr. Iyengar came to town, and I went to his class, and he told us everybody to get up into a handstand or a headstand, and I was in a headstand, and then I felt this incredible beating on my back, and I realized he was kicking me in the spine. And he was kicking me over and over again in the spine, telling me to straighten up and to do this and to do that. And then she says, I came down from the headstand and I was completely electrified because now he was finally going to teach me the reality of yoga. And I'm like, what the fuck are you talking about? He's actually beating you. And how did you believe or get the sense that this was your new sort of spiritual, I don't know, mandate, was to be hyper disciplined or to feel like you were in boot camp? And then when you dig into the history of it, you realize that the modern yoga tradition, as it emerges in Mysore in the 1920s in South India, is really just an amalgamation of older, medieval Indian ideas of asceticism with European physical culture that usually had fascist overtones, right? Coming out of England and Germany and Sweden and Italy and so on. And so that becomes very, very complicated. And it also begins to account for, and this is a lot of what we've covered on Conspirituality, for why wellness culture is so susceptible to echoes of fascist ideology, including ableism and body perfectionism and purity and moving in the correct way and all of this stuff that makes people really, really anxious instead of more relaxed.
Yeah, it's really interesting. You can still see some old video footage of, some of the Danish primal gymnastics system, which some of the poses look almost identical to a lot of the modern. I guess would asana be the right word there? Or
Yeah, asanas. Yeah, yeah. The postures. Yeah,
yeah, and then also the Swedish system. I think with Perlin, and then the German system, and obviously all these were tied up into physical hygiene and early eugenics programs that which should be said that at sometimes were considered progressive
yes.
programs, but obviously we're national reactions, and a lot of what we think of as a modern drill and physical culture. I was always well, I've read that was sort of response to every every however we interpret exercise, health, wellness, it's always a reaction to the anxieties of the time, and we see these things go back and forth: fear of masculinity, fear of military prowess, fear of nationalism, so on and so forth. And I guess what's interesting for me is that with yoga, because it sort of points to this perhaps imaginary or mythic origin when it comes to the way it's practiced in the West now. It almost looks like a time capsule of how you could imagine soldiers in the late Napoleonic era or like early, 20th century practicing military drill. And for me, it's interesting because a lot of what we try to do at Wild Strong is we really try to get away from this top down, leader at the top of the pyramid. You follow what I do, but then you realize that this assumption of how people need to be taught to move, how people need to move in sync, how there's very specific and prescriptive ways of correct movement, correct breathing, all these things that have sort of been internalized, and it's really interesting to see how deeply embedded.
Yeah, and to feel like you're not doing it unless you're in that sequence or unless you're following that choreography, or yeah, there's some sort of template that everybody is supposed to follow. And yeah, that comes out of, well, who are we as a people? What is our nation? What is our national health? And how do we express our nobility and our pride? Yeah.
Yeah. And as you said, nowadays this is really sort of in the lens of neoliberalism. Obviously the unit is the individual now, as opposed to in the past where it might have been like the unit was like the community and things like that, for better or for worse. Obviously things change, but it does mean that it's very easy to market to. So I think we should go ahead and pivot and talk about fitness, Western fitness, things like that, perception of that. So there's a lot of ways I can go, but in the interest of time, I guess I'll just talk about what I'm familiar with. So I used to be a CrossFit coach for about 10 years, and I never really bought in to the rah-rah nature of CrossFit. And what I mean is I was kind of skeptical, but I did see I should give a bit more example. That there are there are a lot of stereotypes about CrossFit that are generally correct, and I think CrossFit, as an organization, has worked hard to soften that in the last few years because I think they've realized you can only go too far with a certain image. But this sort of celebration of vomiting and rhabdomyolysis, and this idea that forging elite fitness, we're better than everybody else, all this kind of stuff. That never appealed to me. But what did appeal to me was that you could get a group of people coming 3 or 4 times a week, working hard, you know, ostensibly less focused on aesthetics and more focused on building capabilities. So I don't think the marketing probably really bore that out. And I thought, this to me, it felt like overall a positive good. And I always practiced CrossFit outside of the States where it was much softer. So, I lived in different expat communities, and it was just a nice way for people to meet together, not take it too seriously, and just do something together. It gave them some kind of focus, which I think was generally a good thing. But then you see that inevitably people took it too seriously, people got hurt. And then you did see these sort of cult-like dynamics did emerge. With Greg Glassman, people would call him coach, and they would, you could hear the italics when they'd say coach says this and coach says that. And I remember getting in arguments all the time with, like, trying to do things, and people were like, "Well, we can't do that. That's not CrossFit."
Right.
Or, you know, and
Yeah.
it's one of those things that eventually I just I kind of lost the enthusiasm for having those conversations, and I thought, well, like, this is on the cusp of being something interesting, but for whatever reason, it seems to it seems that certain social dynamics emerge over and over again in the fitness and wellness space. And there's been a lot of discussion over whether or not CrossFit is a cult. And I know in Conspirituality, I think Derek interviewed someone recently about that very topic. But do you think, is it accurate to say that certain fitness movement, wellness movements turn into cults? Is that the right way to look at it, or is there some other way that we should look at this?
I think that within neoliberalism, the body is the basic site in which power and control and agency are contested. And so I think that it is very easy for people's entire sort of emotional investment to pour into, okay, I don't think I can change anything else in this world. I feel disconnected politically. I feel alienated from my urban environment. I'm, too much sort of sidetracked and not touching grass because of the technology around me. And I think that the body is kind of the last frontier of, I don't know, self-colonization or something like that. It's like it makes a lot of sense to me that these groups or these practices can generate kinds of fervor that I don't think are necessarily suited to other forms of social organization. Like, you don't really see the same kind of thing happening in, I don't know, softball leagues, or I don't know, bowling, or like or I don't know. I mean, there are subcultures of enthusiasm. Like, my kids are into anime and cosplay, but I go to those events or I hang out in those subcultures, and I don't get this sort of anxious feeling of I have to sort of go farther with this, or else I'm not going to know who I am in the world or in relation to God. There's more there's a lot more sort of room for relaxation and kind of play outside of fitness and wellness cultures. I think that also living in the global north and having kind of unlimited, for many people, access to new and unique foods creates a kind of embarrassment of riches that has to be mitigated against either through, reductionism or through fasting or through being extremely particular about what kind of goji berry that you're going to eat because it's magical in this way, when the only reason that you can choose between brands of goji berries is because you're living an unreal life in a fucking late capitalist, hellscape. And so I think that, and but I think the realization that that's the condition you're living in becomes an incentive to make sure that you make the right choice about the goji berry, because like, what else are you going to choose about? And so yeah, I think that for anybody who's really interested in fitness culture, because it has to do with the body and so many other avenues of, sort of empowerment or solidarity or social engagement have withered away, or have been attacked, let's say. I wouldn't say withered away; they're still there. I think that those cultures are very are vulnerable to a kind of obsessive behavior. Yeah,
Yeah, you used the term situational vulnerability earlier, and almost like, if you think of I think Naomi Klein's idea of shock doctrine, when you sort of strip away all the old social connections that a culture used to have, and you just sort of have this I don't know, this empty biome, if you're going to allow me to kind of torture, I guess, a metaphor there. um it does seem that people are more susceptible, and this is true on an individual level, but and I think you probably know Robert Putnam, Bowling Alone.
yeah,
He's
yeah.
Yeah, and this kind of idea that we've lost all these social groups. So I think that, you know you see a lot of these movements pop up that sort of feel like ersatz social groups, but in fact, they're just often different marketing systems.
The first sort of essay that I wrote that was kind of like a political intervention into yoga culture was in a book called 20th Century Yoga. And it was a collection of essays. And the title of it was very long. It was something like, there's no such thing as yoga community unless yoga studios can also be soup kitchens. And my argument was that, with the yoga studio square footage being in use for maybe 15% of any given working day, you have an incredible sort of vacancy rate for potential community organization or hosting that's just underutilized, right? And it's like those studios exist because of gentrification and globalized labor, because the first yoga studios in the global north came into being in places like Toronto's garment district, with like, big warehouses spaces with like hardwood floors and beautiful floor to ceiling windows that were suddenly empty because suddenly people could make their yoga pants in Bangladesh and not be tariffed. And so we have this relationship between the fitness space as being this kind of like self-indulgent place of, self-management. But, actually, if you think about that as being an asset for the community, then why wouldn't you also start to serve other people's needs if obviously people are attributing yoga with spiritual values, right? It's like, why not run a soup kitchen? Why not like start doing AA meetings, or why not host LGBT groups or something like that? Or like, why is that space sitting empty? Like, who is it actually for?
This is a really good point. It makes me think about two things. One thing, I never really thought about the tendency for gyms and wellness spaces to take over post-industrial spaces. It's
Totally.
really interesting that you have this sort of industrial aesthetic in things like CrossFit, or repurposing it for other places.
It's so fucking obvious, because it's like we used to make things here.
Yeah,
We don't make things here. We're just going to buy shit from other places,
yeah, yeah,
from
yeah.
people who are being paid less. And now we have these empty spaces in which we can rebuild ourselves, right? And I'm like, that's not the pathway to dignity, right? That's not that's it's going to you might get more fit and strong and rehab your injuries and stuff like that. But as a kind of spiritual and cultural project, there's a real sort of vacancy, to use a pun, at the heart of it, which is like, how did this space actually emerge? Who is paying for it? Who's paying for it?
There's a in the book The City Authentic. I can't remember the author, but he says, when you go into these sort of gentrified, post industrial spaces, you'll always have like a wine bar that
Yeah.
is named after whatever it used to be, the post office, the foundry.
Yeah, and one other thing that I want to say is that like the process of gentrification actually is, I believe, direct. I would love to see some research on this. I'm sure somebody could do it, but like I think it's directly related to the intensification and professionalization of those spaces as well. And I'll give you the
Mm,
example, which is that the sort of most popular yoga studio here in Toronto, uh, Downward Dog, first opened up in the garment district in a beautiful old warehouse space. And then it got priced out during the dot-com boom. And it had to move down the street, down Queen West, into what was at that point a kind of sketchy neighborhood. It was run down and they opened a big space there. And then they got priced out again. And they keep moving out. It's like not so the yoga studio is like on the bleeding edge of gentrification. And because the economic pressures continue to rise at this like really alarming rate, they start having to offer things like teacher trainings. They start having to like increase the dollar value amount of everything that they're offering. And that usually means inventing new levels of shit, right? And
yeah,
like out of
yeah,
nowhere, out of
yeah.
nothing, usually. It's like,
Which,
yeah, you can be
which is
better
our
at yoga.
capitalism.
You can
Yeah,
be better at yoga, but are you a black belt now? Like it's bizarre. And so the pressure of gentrification really drove the complexity and the professionalization, I believe, of the yoga world to the point at which people are competing over whether they have like a, I don't know, black belt mat or a green belt mat or whatever.
yeah.
And it just
It's interesting.
doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have anything to do with people's actual health.
No, yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree with that across the board, and you see it. It's almost like applying role playing game logic to everything now, where you have these different levels and you have these bonuses and things like that. But it is,
What's your loadout for your yoga session, right?
yeah, exactly. What's your spec? We're going,
Right.
whatever. We're going on a yoga raid tonight. I'm going to need a tank. There's a good distinction in the UK. So the UK has really been focusing a lot on this idea of place-based wellness, which is a word I don't think we use in the States, but they draw this distinction between a place and a venue, and a place is a part of the community where there's no contract involved. You don't need to show your ID to engage with it. It's a public space. It's a space that has meaning to multiple people, whereas the venue is something where, essentially you need to give your identification. There's a transaction. There's probably some sort of contract, and transaction involved in being there.
Yeah.
And the question is all the time, well, how can you give people access to places that provide opportunity for physical activity, for access to green space? And obviously, again, going with your thesis of yoga being, I don't know, a great microcosm of late stage capitalism, is that it's almost always venue based.
Yeah, and the exact, I think the exact opposite space is what I gravitated towards, because I like owned yoga studios, right? Like and so I think I engaged with the sort of paradox of sort of discomfort and shame of actually promoting this kind of like privatized space in which, and I tried to mitigate it. Like I got together with friends, this is 15 years ago, and I founded something called Yoga Community Toronto, and we had this festival that we ran at a nonprofit basis, and that was very interesting and hard to organize. But we we rented out a school for it instead of like a big convention center, and there was no like merchandise, and so I tried to sort of like find some sort of middle path. But when it comes down to it, like the fitness space that feels best to me is like 1 mile from my place here in Toronto. There's a public housing development called Crescent Town that was built in the 1960s, and I don't know how many, probably 10,000 apartments or something like that. And at this point, there's been like one wave of immigrants after another through it. At this point, I would say that probably 70% of the residents there now are like either from Pakistan or Bangladesh or Sudan or places like that. And they built in the 1960s a full-length swimming pool, like I don't know if it's 25 or 50 meters. I can't remember, but a big swimming pool, handball and racquetball courts. There's an indoor track. There's a basketball gym, but it's within the public housing complex, right? And so it's kind of bundled in with the funding for that as a city asset, and that means that the membership rates are really low. And I think if you actually live in the public housing development, you can go there for free. It's just because it's part of your building. It's, you just take the elevator down, and and I'm like, that is the happiest place I have ever been to do any kind of exercise, because it's just people hanging out, and then when they're not working out, they're using the activities room to do their birthday party, or they're doing their some sort of, maybe a coming of age thing in Islam or something like that. I can't remember exactly what all the things are, but it's like, it just feels like the neighborhood, right? And sometimes in the neighborhood you play basketball, and sometimes you swim, and sometimes you take your kids to the kiddie pool. And yeah, so that's what I really love.
You kind of anticipated my final question, so I'll keep in the vein of this, which is, I mean, what you said exactly resonates with me, and I can think of a specific space like that in London as well, where it feels like it's a part of the community, not like you have to get in your car and drive somewhere separate to
Yeah,
perform, fitness rituals in some place that looks like
right.
a temple or a
Show
beautiful.
your ID. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So this is the question that actually I think you already answered really well, but you said you didn't know if you're going to have strong opinions on it. But look, I think at some level we both know there are benefits to engaging in physical activity. We know there are benefits in spending time in community, spending time with people, doing things with people. I like to exercise outside. That's not always reasonable for everyone based on the environment around them and access to well lit spaces, things like that. But, so imagine you get a job at the public health board, or you're working at a governmental or local administrative level, and, they ask you to say, "Look, Matthew, we want people to start engaging in physical activity. We want people to do it with some kind of community level, and we want it to be something that scales up, something that is like, systemically makes sense, not giving everybody a pass to the gym, because that's not going to work for 85% of the population, but actually, you have the resources. What do we do? Like, I mean, how can we actually get people to engage in physical activity more? Um, I mean, this is an open-ended question. I don't expect you to have the answers, but what does your instinct say?
I mean, just from like an urban planning and city politics, municipal politics level, it's like bike lanes and basketball courts. Uh, I mean, bike lanes are much more recent in the global north, but in the 1970s, in the late 1960s, early 1970s, you know, New York City public officials who said we should really put basketball courts in these around these housing developments and just make them free. Let's take this lot, and this lot, put in basketball courts. That basically invented the NBA, right? That invented the fast break, whole styles of play that, like, up until that point, it was like basketball was, standing at the 3-point line in Iowa and shooting buckets, there was no in close hard play. There was no physicality under the boards. Um, it gave so much to so many people, and it was so simple. Bike lanes do the same thing. If you give a safe place for people to ride and commute to work, or to whatever facilities they need to go to, then all kinds of other things open up with regard to how they behave, right? uh, and so you know green space and hiking trails are essential too, that aren't like barriered off by roads, or you don't have to take long transit to get to. There's a walking network through our neighborhood that, if you follow it, with a few big crossings, you can probably walk for 5 miles or something like that. So yeah, that's, you mentioned not everybody has access to outdoor stuff. I would say that, there's a lot of condo developers that are have the proper instinct to attract investors and buyers by making sure that they have good fitness facilities within their developments. And I would say just keep going with that, but let the cities do it. Uh, and make sure that they're rent controlled, and all of that sort of political jazz. It's very difficult to do, but I would say that we already have good models for integrating fitness spaces into our common living spaces. It's just a matter of whether or not the politics allows for inclusivity or not, and that's really just a political question around, like, are we going to socialize more, or are we going to be more barbaric?
We're definitely well past time, but just because there's so much I want to talk about today, I was wondering, is there anything else that didn't come up in the conversation that you just wanted to take some time just to talk about in case it was missed?
One thing that I want to just put a bug in your listeners' ears about is that I interviewed a guy named Ben Case, who's a sociologist of, like, anti-fascist street resistance. Like, what do you do when ICE comes to your neighborhood and tries to take away your neighbors? And he's not only an excellent sociologist, he's also a retired professional Muay Thai fighter. And he has a lot to say about what it means to have physical bravery, and courage, and what it means to realize that your body is actually potentially can protect somebody. And he said two things that I just want to, like, boost. One thing he said was that you know it's kind of odd that MMA and UFC is associated so deeply at this point with right wing
Mm,
politics,
yeah.
because he says, I don't think it's a good match, and the reason why is that people who want to dominate others, fascists as it were, are basically bullies, and bullies are not good at fighting, because what we've found, not only in the ring but also, like, when it comes to Patriot Front or whatever, is that if they're in a large enough group, they can feel threatening. But if they feel like the fight is even, or somebody's going to stand up to them, then they generally run away. And so he said, I think that actual real fighting arts puts you in the position where you realize you have to be fair. And bullies do not want to be fair. They do not thrive in environments of fairness. And then the second thing he said was, and that's why we're seeing some kind of growth in literal anti-fascist fight clubs, or fighting arts clubs, in the global north, where, it's basically, if you're trans, you should come here and learn how to be physically brave if you want to, right? And we'll welcome you, and that's what it's for. And so I just want to, like, put that out there and say that, if you felt that, certain forms of physical culture are just sort of like reactionary politically, or naturally, I don't know, testosterone driven or something like that, I think that might be changing, and there's good reason for that.
That's really interesting. I think that probably merits a whole nother conversation because I'm thinking about it, and like oddly enough, MMA is one of the only sports that I ever really followed, and I'm trying to think about what are what are the historical reasons why it is that MMA is perceived as being right wing now, and I think a lot of that would have to do with UFC, Dana White, perhaps the big, perhaps the wrestling foundation that that really made up modern MMA. But then
Oh,
I think
yeah, the
back.
McMahons, right? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, well, yeah, that's true. Obviously, the McMahon's being involved as well. I didn't. I was thinking like traditional folk wrestling and Greco-Roman. But you're right. Yeah, I think that the very base of WWE and all that. But yeah, then I was thinking of boxers. It's interesting because
Yeah.
you think of the old boxers, and a lot of times there are guys who are like it. They were part-time trade unionists. They were
Yes.
factory workers.
Yes.
They were part of something. Boxing gyms would show up in industrial areas, and it's like it's always interesting because you see these different eras where different immigrant groups dominated the sport.
Yeah.
Whether it's Jewish immigrants, Eastern European
Right.
immigrants, or later, African Americans, or people from Central America.
Right.
And boxing has always been a sport, in a way of first, second generation immigrants. And
Yes.
it's interesting to see how that was taken, and as it was professionalized, and as is so often the case, once something goes into the market, then it changes the incentives, create perverse incentives. But you're right, there is no reason why a certain kind of physical bravery and physicality can't be associated with leftist causes.
Yeah.
But it does seem, as you said at the beginning of the conversation, that for whatever reason, there does seem to be this assumption, that physicality necessarily makes someone more right wing.
Yeah, the book is not written on that. So anyway, yeah, check out Ben Case. Yeah, I really appreciated what I was able to learn from him.
Matthew, thanks a lot for your time. Thanks for being generous and giving me an extra 20 minutes. I really appreciate that. Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed this. I learned a lot. I think our listeners will enjoy it as well. So much appreciated.
Thank you, Andrew.
It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise. It's a daily exercise.
Okay, so that was my chat with Matthew Remski. If you like what you had to say, be sure to check out his podcast, Conspirituality. They get some very interesting guests on there, and they cover some interesting topics. Like I said, it's a bit more political than we generally do, but I've definitely learned a lot from listening to it over the years. Also, check out his books as well. I like this conversation a lot, and there's some interesting things that he was talking about. I think sort of dissecting the origins of yoga, both the medieval ascetic practice and also sort of the nationalistic kind of project that emerged in the 1960s is very interesting. And then tying it all back to some of the military drill gymnastics programs, from the sort of 19th century is something that's interesting, because I think we can always see a lot of parallels between fitness or wellness culture in the past and how we see it now. I'd like to interview a few more people on this topic in the future, because I think it is worth talking about. And one of the points that I thought Matthew made very well is that the issues we're talking about were not unique to yoga specifically, but they're sort of a reflection of other societal issues. What he was saying specifically is sort of that post-Vietnam, retreat away from civic mindedness, and focusing more on the individual, and sort of how much of health culture does focus on the individual. It makes me think of our conversation with Cormac Russell, when he was talking about Wendell Berry and this idea of community being the smallest unit of health, where really that logic has kind of flipped on its head recently, where I think we spend so much time trying to optimize ourselves, whether through aesthetics or hopefully, trying to achieve some form of longevity, that sometimes I think the pursuit of some of the more extreme aspects of fitness culture can almost be antisocial in a way. I don't think that's necessarily true for most people. I think for most people, it's a nice social outlet. But again, I think the way we see it pan out on social media sometimes can really lean into some of the worst aspects of that. So that was my chat with Matthew, and I hope you enjoyed it. If you ever want to give us feedback, always send us an email. You can find my email at the website, and we have info@wildstrong.co. You can always send comments to. I don't know if Jill normally says this, but it is really helpful if you write positive comments and give those, I guess they're 5-star reviews on Apple Podcasts, because it does help with visibility in the feed, and it does help us to get some bigger guests out there. So there's a few people I've been trying to get for the last few months, and hopefully we can get them in, because I think they'll have some interesting things to say. But anyway, thanks as always for listening. Hope you enjoyed it, and have a good autumn. Bye.